So I have attempted the exam 2 times, and thankfully I passed the exam both times. As a matter of fact, the only reason I had to take it a second time was because when I was ready to use my results, unfortunately it was past the validity period of my first one. So I had to take it a second time. Hey guys, how is everyone going? I hope you're doing okay wherever you are. So today I'm going to be talking about IELTS, which is the English language exam that you would usually have to write if you're interested in studying abroad or taking advantage of some migration program to an English speaking country, usually. So yes, I am sure that if you are familiar with IELTS, you would probably have heard a lot of horror stories about how difficult it is to pass the exam, and maybe you have a personal experience or you've heard from someone who has attempted the exam, and you just don't have any good things to say about IELTS. Well, I'm hoping that this video helps you. I'm hoping that you can maybe get a few helpful tips from this video about how to pass the exam. Now, before I continue, I just need to make one thing clear. All right, so this is not like a tutorial type video. I am not going to be giving you a blow by blow or a comprehensive methods on how to pass the exams. What I'm going to be passing along would just be tips, things that I have picked up on my own, in my own experience with that exam, and how I was able to pass that exam twice. So I have attempted the exam 2 times, and thankfully I passed the exam both times. As a matter of fact, the only reason I had to take it a second time was because when I was ready to use my results, unfortunately it was past the validity period of my first one. So I had to take it a second time. Yeah, but both times that I attempted the exam, like I said, I passed. So in this video, it's going to be based on my own experience, basically. Just a bit of a background into my own experience and the times that I did take the exam. So the first time, it was going to be in line with meeting the requirements for enrollment into a course, a master's course at uni. Unfortunately, I ended up not studying that course. Like, I changed my mind, but I had already written the exam at that time and I did pass. So that result was sort of like a waste because I never really used it. And in my first attempt, I came in at an overall score of 8.0, and the list that I had in one of the bands was 7.5. Yes. And the requirements for enrollment in that particular course was that I needed to pass at a 7 overall with no band less than 7. So at 7.5 as my least score, obviously I made the cut and my overall score was 8.0. Now the second time around, when I attempted that exam, I was aiming for a higher score because it was to do with gaining maximum points under the language category for applying to become a permanent resident here in Australia. So I was aiming for a higher score of 8 or 9. And thankfully, my overall score was 8.5, and the least that I had in one of my bands was 8.0. So again, I passed the exam. Now, this is what I learned, okay, when I was preparing for that exam the second time. And I say the second time because the first time I didn't go into the exam the first time with a very good morale, if I would say that. I wasn't keen on the course that I was going to study then, so I was very ambivalent in my engagement with the whole process, and it was also carried through into that exam. But thankfully, I passed. But the second time around, I had a worthy goal, if you can call it that, to prepare even harder, and to aim for the score that I wanted. So I put in a bit more effort the second time around. Now, it was good. I still, even though I ended up not using my first result, I think it was a good experience for me to sort of, test out that exam and just see for myself what the exam experience was like. Okay, so it was good in that regard that I attempted the exam the first time, and I got familiar with the structure of the exam. It really helped in shaping how I prepared for my second attempt. So when I finished my first, when I wrote the first exam, I discovered that I struggled to beat the time. And I guess this would also be something that a lot of us would struggle with as well. So I struggled with completing my tasks within the allocated time, and I also struggled a bit more specifically in my reading tasks. And the listening was also a bit of a challenge. So what did I do then? First of all, when it came to preparing, I didn't do any special thing, in terms of enrolling in a special preparatory class or anything of that nature. I didn't do any of that. I did my practice in the house, sitting in the house, using freely available online resources. All I did was a simple Google search to find free online practice IELTS tests, and I practiced as many of those tests as I could find on the internet. Now, worthy of mention is one particular site that I found really helpful, especially around improving management of my time and also with the reading tasks. And I guess one other good thing about this site is that it's got a function where you can actually practice your tests under exam-like conditions. So there's like a simulated exam function on that site, which I found really helpful. So if you decided to go that way, if you decided to take that route on that site, then you can expect to be scored and also expect to be timed while you are attempting those practice tests. And I found that really useful. It's all free to use, so you don't have to pay anything. And I'm going to put a link to that site below so you can try it out for yourself. And especially if your areas of improvement are in reading or listening, then that site would be particularly helpful for you. I found it useful. I hope you find it useful as well. Anyway, so I took a few tests on that site, took a few practice tests on that site. And by the time I worked through a few of those tests, I was then beginning to establish a pattern around what I was doing wrong and and how to improve on it. So I found out that with the reading tasks, okay, my approach, like my usual approach of, tackling the reading tasks in a very traditional manner, and I guess this is what a lot of us are also doing, was not helping. Okay, I was losing good time by approaching it in such a traditional way. When most of us are presented with a comprehension passage where we have to answer questions following that, we would usually want to read the whole thing first, make sure we understand what we've read before we go on to attempting the questions, right? That's what most of us do. But I found out that for the purpose of the IELTS exam, okay, it wasn't helping. It was only making me lose precious time. So the strategy that I devised, and I guess you can take this as the first tip, okay, was number one, to skim through the passage. And in skimming through the passage, the intention, okay, was not so much to understand every single detail or every little bit of detail in that passage, but just to establish the idea behind each paragraph of that passage. And as soon as you have a good idea what is in that paragraph, you don't need to go any further, trying to remember every single detail in that paragraph. Move on to the next paragraph, okay? And then do the same thing for all the paragraphs within that passage. Now, if you go on to the questions, you would find that the questions are also structured in a certain way. So the reading questions are very similar. And what I mean by this is that every IELTS exam that you would ever attempt would follow the same structure in the way that the questions are asked. So you just want to get familiar with that structure, number one, which is really important. So I guess that's my second tip. Get familiar with that structure, because you're probably going to be seeing something similar when you go in to take your own exams. Now, another thing that I discovered, and this is really important, guys, it was like I found gold when I discovered this. Another thing I found out about how the questions are asked is that the questions follow the progression of the passage. Okay, so the questions work through from the top of the passage to the end of the passage. If, for instance, you have 8 questions, you would most likely not find the answer to question 8 in the beginning of the paragraph or in the beginning of the passage. Neither will you be finding the answer to question number 1 at the end of your passage. If there is nothing else you remember, okay, about the listening part of the exam, okay, I want you to remember this. The strategy you want to devise is around training your mind, and you're training your mind to stay with the recording. So for those of you who have never attempted the exam, the listening exam is basically where a recording is played. You listen to this recording and then you answer the questions in front of you. Now, the trick with the listening part of the exam is that you want to be able to catch those answers as they are being said, because that recording is not going to be repeated. You only get to listen to it once. So the risk is that if you do not catch the answer to a particular question in front of you, you would probably get into that phase where you panic. Basically, you go into a panic trying to remember that answer. But remember, because the recording is not going to be paused, you stand a real risk, okay? A real chance of missing out on the answers to all the other questions following that one that you missed. And you're just going to end up in a really bad place. So the trick here is to train your mind to stay with the recording. Even if you have missed one answer, it's better you miss one answer, okay, in the whole of that recording than to miss the whole thing, isn't it? So stay with the recording. And this is actually something, and I know it sounds really obvious, but when you are in exam conditions, there's nothing normal about that. And you would very likely freak out. And so as soon as you realize that you've missed the answer to a particular question in front of you and that the recording has moved beyond where that answer was located, the natural tendency is for you to freak out, is for you to panic. And once you panic, your mind gets out of the flow of things. You're not following the recording anymore. Instead, your mind is scrambling to remember what has already passed. So you want to make sure that you keep your mind in the here and now. If you have missed one, let it go. Keep going. And again, this is something that requires a lot of practice for you to master. Okay, so, and that is the beauty of, the practice test. Practice as many of those tests as you can, okay, and you will get it down pat. So that's it for the listening. Now let's move on to the writing. I particularly have not struggled with my writing. Writing is actually one of my strong points, when it comes to English language testing. So I've never really struggled with my writing. But of course, for a lot of people, there are several bits within the writing exercise that they struggle with. It might be around beating the time, making sure that you complete your writing tasks within the time. That might be your challenge, or it might be around, just the structure of your writing, not knowing what to write, or not knowing exactly what is required of you in your writing tasks. So here I am going to share tips on how I do mine. I have passed every time that I have attempted the exam, so I'm hoping that the tips I'm going to be sharing count for something when you do attempt your own exam. So with the writing, I guess one of the things that are important with your writing, apart from beating the time, which is something that you can do by practicing as many of those tests as you can manage, one of the things is, some very basic things which you would think are obvious, but which a lot of people still struggle with or do not pay as much attention to. So simple things like punctuation, simple things like starting your sentences with capital letters and ending with a full stop. Very simple things like that, like simple basic things. You should be paying attention to those. You want to make sure that your sentences are complete sentences, sentences that carry and convey a full meaning. Okay, paragraphing. Okay, so you want to pay attention to that as well. You don't want to be jumbling up different ideas in one paragraph. Okay, so separate your paragraphs so that each paragraph conveys one major idea. Okay, and then when it comes to the very fine details, you also then, this is where you want to consider the structure of your sentences, your grammar, how diverse your grammar is and your expressions. And basically, if I remember correctly, there are two writing tasks. So one of them is where you have to give an essay type answer. So you write an essay to a topic. And then the other one is where you have to do some work around interpreting data that is usually presented in pictorial form, like a graph, a bar chart, a table, something along those lines. So with your first writing task, which is where you're going to be required to write an essay, think about being creative. This is where you want to go all out. Now, I want you to remember that the English test in general is about your mastery of the English language. It's about how confident you are in the use of the English language, whether in writing or speaking, listening or reading. Okay, so, and I guess with your listening and your reading, there's not a lot of output from you. Okay, so with your reading, you're already provided a passage that you have to read and then answer questions based on what you've read. With your listening, you're also listening to a recording. So it's something that's been provided for you. But with your writing and your speaking, this is where the output comes from you. And this is where you have an opportunity to showcase what you can do with the language. So with your writing, like I said, think about those basic stuff. And then as much as you want your sentences to be properly structured, you want your grammar to be correct, you want your tenses to be correct. It is good, to have simple sentences, but if you can take it up a notch, okay, and show some diversity in how you structure your ideas and how you structure your sentences, that would be great as well. So what I'm saying is find different ways to say the same thing. And maybe that's something you want to practice on your own. So instead of, if maybe you want to you're going to be referring very much in your writing to one particular thing. Okay, find different ways of saying that thing. So, and one way to do that is to pay attention to synonyms, words that are similar in meaning to other words, so that you can switch those things up and not be using the same sorts of expressions over and over again. Use what you know you're confident using. Okay, so as long as you're confident in the use of your expressions, please go ahead, but please be sure to check your spellings, check your tenses, make sure that you're using tenses in the proper context, your spelling, punctuations, and all those other basic things. So the second writing task that requires you to interpret data, what I have found useful is using lots of comparative terms or terms that convey comparison or contrast. So I want you to be thinking words like unlike, in addition to, the same as, similar to, different from, those kinds of expressions. So the idea there is that you want to link ideas in such a way that they show whether you're making a comparison or you're contrasting something from the data. I mean, when you are interpreting data, it's all about that. It would be about reporting trends, reporting a pattern that can be found on that data. And so you're going to be doing a lot of comparisons. So I want you to be thinking about those words, okay, that convey the interpretation of that data along the lines of comparing the data or contrasting the data and things like that. So we move on to the speaking test. Now, if you remember what I said about the writing tasks, the speaking is another opportunity for you to showcase what you can do with the language. So this is an avenue for you to display and demonstrate your confidence in using the language. So you want to think about diversifying your diction, pull out all those interesting words in your vocabulary. Feel free to use them. The only thing is you need to be sure that you're using those words in the correct context. You're paying attention to the basic stuff like your pronunciation and your tenses. You want to make sure that you're pronouncing your words clear enough so that your examiner, who is going to be sitting with you there, like who's going to be physically present with you, has no confusion at all about what you are saying. Okay, so that's like the basic stuff. Now, another thing that I want you to keep at the front of your mind is that no one is going to be testing, the accuracy of your answers and how they relate to the subject. Okay, so this is not about subject related accuracy or statistically correct answers. No, it's about these other things that I have mentioned, your confidence in using the language. So you may as well be talking rubbish in relation to the subject that you've been asked to speak about. Okay, but okay, what the examiner is looking out for is, are you fluent in your use of the language in your speaking? Are you fluent? Are you stuttering? Are you using the wrong tenses? Are you just going on and on without taking the necessary pauses and breaks in your speech, to enhance the meaning and the understanding, for the person who is listening to you? Are you doing all of that? So that's just it. That is it. A lot of times I have seen people who get so fixated on the accuracy of the answers in relation to the topic. And as soon as you get into that rut, you're already getting everything wrong. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. And then this is especially important for those of us who do not speak English as a first language. So if you are not a native English speaker, I think it will be helpful for you to remember to go slow. Go slow. I have found that the way that my brain functions, okay, when I am speaking my native language is very different from when I am speaking another language, okay, like English. So even though I have been taught in English all my life, and I guess my English is reasonably good, I am still aware that there is a difference in how my brain functions. When I am speaking in my native language, I am not tuning in as much, okay, to what my brain is doing and how it is processing the words that I am saying, as much as it happens when I'm communicating in English. So one way for you to make accommodations for that lag in, the speed of the processing going on in your brain is for you to slow down. By slowing down, you give your brain the time and the space it needs to process those words as you're saying them. Okay, so slow down. I understand that for a lot of people, and it happens to me too, when you are nervous, which is something that a lot of people can relate to in exam conditions, when you are nervous, you tend to speak faster. Okay, but if you remember that speaking too fast puts you at risk of stuttering, puts you at risk of forgetting your words. It happens to me. Like when I go too fast, I get to a point where I am scrambling in my brain around the right word to use in that particular context. And of course, what that does is, there's a lag in your fluency, a lag in your flow, and that can trigger panic. So you don't want to give room for that. So slow down. That's, if there's nothing else you remember that I have spoken about right now, I want you to remember that one. And then don't be so hung up on giving accurate answers related to the subjects that you have been asked to speak on. Now, I remember that the speaking tests, the first part of it is where the examiner asks you basic questions and you would just have to speak for a few seconds. And one thing that I want to also highlight here is that even if the questions that are being thrown at you, okay, on the surface of it require a yes or a no, please do not stop at a yes or a no. If you agree with something, explain why you agree with it. If you do not agree, again, talk about why you don't agree. Don't just stop at giving yes or no or one word answers. It's not going to do you any favors. So speak at length, but do not speak too much, especially for that first part where you only have to give very short answers. Now, the second part of the test is where the examiner would give you a topic to talk about. And here you're usually allowed about 2 to 3 minutes to talk about this particular topic. So again, this is where you would be this is where you would struggle about being correct with your answers and wanting to make sure that you are talking, that whatever you're saying or the answers you're giving are related to that topic, okay? But like I said, it does not matter. I remember that in my first exam, I was asked to speak about something business related. I'm not a business person, or at that time, I had even less business experience. So I think I was asked to speak about how to start a business. Geez. And I was there thinking, oh my goodness, I've never started a business. I don't have any experience. But then I remembered, this is not about giving accurate answers. No one is asking me to give a blow-by-blow account or a blow-by-blow explanation about how to register a company and what happens after you register, and how to become a public liability or something along those lines. Nobody's asking you that. So I remember that what I did speak about was, and I was open to the examiner at that point. I was like, well, even though I do not have much of an experience in starting a business, I do remember that when my mom started a business or when my auntie started a business, they did blah, 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 and blah, and I just flowed on from there and I said what I knew. And I know that some of the things that I said, okay, had no relation to starting a business. Like if I was in a business meeting or some kind of business conference, what I spoke about would have no relevance at all. But I wasn't in a business conference. Yes. So that's what you need to keep in mind. Nobody's asking you to be a scientist if you're asked to speak on a science-related topic. Nobody's asking you to know what scientists do. I just want you to keep that in mind. So that's it. Go slow. Don't worry about statistically correct answers or topic related accuracy. Don't worry about that. And to kind of wrap up everything that I have said or summarize everything really neatly, I would also encourage you to be as prolific a reader as you can manage. Well, it's not only reading actually. Do not pass up opportunities for you to write. Write, make as many mistakes as you can and have them corrected by someone that you trust or someone whose mastery of the language you trust, okay? Don't be shy to do all these things. I actually find that, and that's why I said that I didn't have to do any special preparations for IELTS, like to actually improve my English. It was more around getting familiar with the structure of the exam. And this is because I think that my habit of reading and writing actually came in handy when it was time for me to take that exam. And, there is no harm in wanting to improve yourself long term along those lines, okay? So just develop that habit. Read as widely as you can, read as much as you can. You only want to make sure that you are engaging with quality materials. And maybe you also want to be conscious when you read about noticing how sentences are constructed, noticing how the whole writing or whatever you're reading has been structured. So you want to take note of those things, because those are some of the things that you can carry on into the exam as well. You can sort of model your writing around other quality materials that you've read, and keep writing. You can find someone who you trust their mastery of the language to edit your writing or to look through what you've done and give you some constructive feedback. All these little things would help. Okay, so that's just like final words for me. So I hope you found this video useful. Drop me your comments and your questions, and if I am able to answer them, I will answer them. Okay, I may not have the answers to everything that you would ask me, especially if they are very specific. Okay, but let it not stop you from answering, from asking rather, because I know that a lot of people do read the comments as well. So even if I don't know the answer, hopefully someone who knows the answer can provide that answer to you. So until I come your way again, stay safe and keep practicing.